The jackhammering has stopped outside, so now it's time to start with the jackhammering inside. Let's grow. So where did systems administration jobs go? This is the question. When I started systems work, it was not too difficult to find jobs. And what job postings and companies were asking for didn't seem unreasonable at that time. Of course, this was 15 years ago, so things have changed quite a bit. But before we get too deep into that, I wanted to go over a few things first and how we got into this situation. So I wanted to start by talking about systems and system work, different types of systems administration roles. So with systems, to begin with, what sort of would you be working with, or are the expectations? To me, what I think about first is hardware, and that's doing stuff like break fix type of work, determining if there is an issue, what the issue is, and then how to address it. It's installation of hardware, it's decommissioning hardware or deprovisioning, cabling, power. It's dealing with firmware, updating firmware on and configuring on motherboards, on IPMI or DRAC, like remote access firmware, network device firmware, and anything else that has firmware that can be managed. There is operating systems, which I feel like is a pretty big part that you'll generally be dealing with day to day if you're not dealing with hardware. But I guess with the way virtualization is now, maybe operating systems is less of a focus than it used to be. And also, operating systems have come a long way. They do a lot more, I feel like, than they used to out of the box. There's less work involved to do most things generally. But yeah, operating systems like Linux or FreeBSD. And then there is software and services. And this includes doing things like user management or services like web services, and software, which could be client-based software or the server-based software for services. Then there is networking, which I believe I don't know, it's a toss-up. Would you consider DNS a software service or a network service? I guess that would be a software service if I think about it, but I don't know. That could potentially go either way. And then part of networking could be cabling, and I feel like a big thing in networking is architecture or traffic shaping. And of course, of all of those, you have provisioning, you have maintenance, you have decommissioning. So these are all sort of things that I feel like generally fall into the systems realm. The one that could be potentially excluded would be networking. There's generally experts or subject matter experts in networking, so I could see that being not part of a systems administrator type role, with the exception of like the client side. It makes sense to configure things like IPs on a system, stuff like that. So with that said about systems, what may be included in systems, there are roles. Systems administrator is one of those. And according to Wikipedia, information technology administrator or system administrator is someone who is responsible for upkeep, configuration, and reliable operation of computer systems, especially multi-user computers, such as servers. The system administrator seeks to ensure that the uptime, performance, resources, and security of the computers they manage meet the needs of the users without exceeding a set budget when doing so. I think this is fairly reasonable description here on Wikipedia. I would word some of these things different, but that's fine. Yeah, uptime is a big metric to go by when you're offering services. When it comes to hardware, you usually have failover of some kind. Performance is a great one. A big selling point of having information technology administrator or system administrator is someone who can appropriately size workloads for cost-saving purposes. And this is both with on-site hardware or if you're using a service provider. This is a big one. And I guess these kind of go together, performance and resources, when I'm thinking about them. Of course, there's performance optimizations that can happen on the software level that are unrelated to hardware. So I guess resources may be more hardware focused and performance may be more software focused. And then security, which is sort of like a cornerstone. You have operators who will kind of do things out of the box, and then you'll have people who are more mindful or concerned about compromises or penetrations. And so you might get more of a focus there. And of course, all of this is for the user. Thanks, Tron. Yeah. So I feel like in the past, systems administrators were like dealing with hardware and like Apache, like web servers. And I worked for a web hosting provider based out of Los Angeles 15 years ago. And you didn't need to know much about hardware, but if you did, it was a big deal back then. Now, with service providers, understanding hardware is a lot less of a thing when it comes to understanding the physical side of the hardware. Understanding performance and things like that, you don't need to understand the hardware as much. And when I talk about this, I mean like how you run your cabling, how you run your like power and data, how they're routed between when it comes to like redundancy and failover, and then also capacity, basically. Like these kinds of things, I feel like it was valuable to have this knowledge in the past. Now, I think unless you're doing architecture, it might not be as important unless you're like the engineer who's tracking down like, oh, well, why is this behaving this way? We don't know. Who can figure this out? And you have to be able to go through more of the stack to understand the situations. And these are all things that I feel like systems people do or have an understanding of or a interest in understanding. But yeah, so that's systems administrators. Then we have operations engineers. And according to Wikipedia, it is a branch of engineering that's mainly concerned with the analysis and optimization of operational problems using scientific and mathematical methods. More frequently, it has applications in the areas of broadcasting, industrial engineering, and also creative and technology industries. So I don't know if this second half needs to be included with this, but I guess they're just trying to fill it out, or the scientific and mathematical methods. Maybe the definition of this has changed over time, but when I was working as an operations engineer, or at least that was the title, it was for 2 different content delivery network services. And the work was more supporting services and the operations. It was more focused on day-to-day, like what's happening, like break fix, some capacity planning, and then some more long-term projects. Like, I guess back then, this would have been more like 10 years ago or so. Technology wasn't, or software, I should say, wasn't where it is now. There was more in-house. There's probably just as much in-house software being built as there was back then, but things were more bare bones. These days, I feel like in open source, you can have multiple applications or software that will do the same thing. And back then, you sometimes had no options or one option, and that one option might not have done what you needed. So open source has come so far in the past 10 years, and definitely in the past 15 years, because you can find something for almost everything you need now. And if you don't, that's a huge opportunity. Oh yeah, I did do operations for a recommendation service in San Francisco maybe 8 years ago or so. And these are all things that fall within systems administration, operations engineer. This next one, site reliability engineering. And my understanding is that this came from a sort of evolution of systems administration from Google. And so it's more of an approach. But Wikipedia says, site reliability engineering is a set of principles and practices that applies aspects of software engineering to IT infrastructure and operations. Software reliability engineering creates scalable IT systems, is similar to DevOps, a set of software and development practices. Yeah, so I feel like this is the big thing. It's like the software engineering approach to systems, basically, infrastructure and operations. Yeah, so this is sort of an evolution of systems administration. I feel like systems administration now is different than what it used to be because it's more like SRE, where you have like version control systems for your configuration, or they call it configuration management now. And not just versioning, but systems built specifically for managing your configuration. Like these things, you had to build them yourself back then, but they're all available now. And that's just one more thing that if you have experience with, that's great. If you don't, you're likely going to have to learn it one way or another. If you don't, then what a great job you have. And maybe we jumped into software reliability engineering a little early because we spoke about operations engineering, but not infrastructure engineering. So let's talk about infrastructure engineering. And we do not have a Wikipedia for that. But that, I feel like, is more involved with hardware and capacity planning and sort of the architecture of systems. And that all goes into sort of the backbone of what everything else relies on. So I feel like things like DNS or user management can be more part of infrastructure engineering. But yeah, dealing with the backbone, networking, supporting both hardware and services for things that other software or services rely on or users rely on. And I did infrastructure engineering with an open source and hardware firewall company based out of Texas. And also for a, I guess, space agency, I did infrastructure support based out of Los Angeles. And these jobs, it feels like there's less of them now when there should be more, as there's more IT and more software, more technology companies. I feel like this job there should be more of, but it doesn't feel that way. And I'll talk about that more later. But yeah, after infrastructure, I probably should have spoken about site reliability. But also, as this article mentioned, DevOps. Everyone's a DevOps. What's a DevOps? Nobody knows. According to Wikipedia, developer operations is a methodology in the software development and IT industry used as a set of practices and tools. DevOps integrates and automates the work of software development and IT operations as a means of improving and shortening the system's development lifecycle. Development operations is complementary to agile software development. Is it really? Several developer operations aspects came from the agile way of working. Is that true? Automation is an important part of developer operations. Software programmers and architects should use fitness functions to keep their software in check. So this one, I feel like this particular Wikipedia article might have gone a little bit off the deep end here with some of its assumptions. I do agree absolutely that developer operations is more like developer systems support. Absolutely, automation is a big part of it. And continuous integration and continuous delivery pipelines are absolutely, I feel like, part of developer operations. And it seems like this day, it also means a programmer. If you're going to do developer operations, it feels like there's an assumption that you are also going to be a programmer. And sometimes in job postings, the expectations are for very specific things, a specific language, a specific tool or piece of software, which is not unreasonable as long as there is appropriate compensation for, regardless if it's niche or not niche. Of course, I guess the market sort of determines if it's niche or not. But as long as their compensation reflects the requirement for specific tools, then I guess that's understandable. In the past, like I mentioned, the tools weren't there. So the requirements were more, this is the situation we're in. And either they don't want to be in that situation is the description, or they can describe what situation they do want to be in. And yeah, I have experience with developer operations in multiple places. The thing is, a lot of these titles are used interchangeably and not accurately. So going based on title, I feel like, is not always the best way to go when searching for this type of work because of how interchangeably they've been used. I've done this sort of infrastructure and developer support for a website development company. They did it for law firms and they were off of Wall Street. One thing that is more popular than it used to be is self-hosters. So how does Wikipedia describe self-hosting? It's the practice of running and maintaining a website or service using a private web server instead of using services outside of the administrator's own control. Self-hosting allows users to have more control over their data, privacy, computing infrastructure, as well as potentially saving costs and improving skills. I feel like this could use a little work. Because to self-host does not necessarily mean you're hosting on your own hardware. I feel like it generally means you're managing your own services and you're not paying, or you're not going with a service provider to provide the managed service to you. You're managing it, basically. These days, there are so many services that people self-host. Most seem to be web-based these days. That's probably the biggest change. But in the past, if you wanted to run your own BBS, I would consider that self-hosting. So in the past, you would get more administrators from places where they had resources to self-host, like universities or colleges. And then early on in the past, there was other self-hosting people did, like running their own websites, like this mentions. This is probably like the number one thing that people do is self-hosting a website. These days, it's less that because there's so many paid-for services these days that people pay for, like I guess video streaming services or audio streaming services that people do their own. They self-host themselves. And it can be definitely, like they mentioned, more, if you're running it yourself, you don't have to deal with a third party's privacy or security. That's another big one, which sort of ties into privacy in a way. If they're compromised, you lose any sense of privacy when the data's been leaked. But yeah, it feels like there's more people who can do administration these days than there used to be. And it seems like there should be more opportunity to host, but it doesn't feel that way. Yeah, and as self-hosting, yeah, you can have a third party for hosting. You can host on your own hardware, or you can do co-location, which would be your own hardware in a data center. And the data center is providing power and data. But yeah, where have all of these jobs gone? So this is where it gets really into the thick of it. Managed systems hosting is, I feel like, ate up a lot of the work. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing if they're providing a level of service that you might not have been able to previously as a company within your budget. So if you're going with Amazon or Google or Microsoft for your hosting of systems, and they even offer services, which is another layer of offerings, a lot of jobs have gone there. So you could work for Amazon or Google or Microsoft, but I feel like due to the amount of automation, the type of roles available are really limited, and I feel like might be more niche and more like senior level. I would be really curious how many junior level roles there might be within those service providers. Yeah. Those are the big three. Of course, you have Hetzner and like DigitalOcean. I'm curious what the market share is for hosting or infrastructure as a platform, or even just the services they offer. So a lot of jobs have gone there, where this is the situation we're in now, where I feel like companies will they will put higher requirements on a developer. Whether or not they actually compensate for that is another story. But they will have an expectation for the developer to build on top of an existing platform like Amazon Web Services. And their goal would be then to either remove all systems administrators or reduce. And I feel like that is a rough situation to be in. If I was a developer, I feel like I would want to be focused more on the application side and less on the backend side. But this is the world we're in, or I guess they might just put the title as full stack developer, and their expectation is that you're going to know how to do I don't really want to get into how deep of another role you would basically be having to do. And sometimes I feel like the DevOps or developer operations positions that are listed, is their expectation is that you're a developer, but you're going to handle all of the back end as well. And that's just so much cognitive load and so much experience required that the compensation must be sky high for some of these roles, because you're basically doing more than one person's job. I understand where if you're a developer and you're responsible for your own applications, like uptime and things like that, if you're on call for the code you've written, that I understand. But it's another thing if it's like, oh, well, AWS has an outage, and as a developer, it's your responsibility to be handling the failover to multiple systems. I mean, developers, if you're doing this kind of work, the demand for you must be so high. I mean, the compensation must be unbelievable. But that's one place jobs have gone, is managed systems hosting or managed infrastructure hosting. The other thing is, it might seem like there are less jobs because where you look for jobs, it's a different world now than it was in the past. in the past, you could go on LinkedIn or Indeed and look at posting and generally find actual job listings for companies that are looking to fill these positions. These days, it's hard to go to these websites like LinkedIn because, one, there are companies that will list positions that either they intend to outsource or fill internally, and they're required either by law or their own policy to list these positions. And so it's not really an honest posting. The other thing is, so this was true in the past, but it's more so now today, where a recruiting agency or an agency trying to collect data either for recruiters or for other purposes, which can totally be nefarious. They're trying to collect information, basically. And I don't know if LinkedIn or any other website is doing anything to remove these listings so that people aren't compromised or their data isn't just being harvested. I would imagine if someone is paying LinkedIn to promote or advertise one of their job listings, that's what LinkedIn's focus would be, or these other hosting companies, because that's what pays their bills. So they might not be incentivized to remove these listings where a company has had it listed for 6 months or a year or years, and either the job is not a real job, they have no intention to hire for that position, or it's just harvesting data. So that's one of those things where it's like, the only thing I can think of is you see the listing on LinkedIn and then you have to leave LinkedIn and go search for the company and try and determine, is this a real company? Are they actually hiring for this role? And then apply to their website directly and not use LinkedIn. So it's sort of like an aggregator minus all the effort of having to do for the job application. And these days, I guess, where are companies posting their jobs? They're posting them on their own website. Hopefully, if they're not, that's feels really sketchy. I don't understand why a company wouldn't list an opening on their own website, but I guess there might be reasons, whether they're questionable or not reasons. And then there's third-party websites like LinkedIn or Indeed or any of these other company websites. And then the worst is really, like I mentioned, when it's not listed anywhere and it's with an internal, or the worst part is external recruiters. And you get these emails all the time. Oh yeah, we have this opening and you're the perfect fit, but could you send us your resume? And also, it's listed as remote and hybrid and in a specific city, in a specific country. Like, I don't know how you can clown yourself more than that. But when I see those are like immediately, I feel like I should just make a website that lists these recruiting agencies and companies that behave in this way. Because do people prefer finding new work in this way? I know, like, when you have a job and you're reached out to by recruiters, it definitely strokes your ego in a way. But functionally, I feel like the majority of the time, what they're offering or what these recruiters are trying to get out of you do not match at all what you might be looking for. It's possible, especially if you're desperate. But yeah, so the next thing is for what listings there are out there that may or may not be real listings is the requirements. When you're looking for systems work, it seems, I want to say 50-50, but it might be more than that they're expecting you to be able to program. And sometimes it will be in a specific language. So their requirement might be, yes, you have to know Python or JavaScript or Java or Perl. I feel like sometimes it's in the fine print, these requirements, and I feel like it should be more obvious, like systems admin Perl in the title. Like, if their expectation is, yeah, we have all these tools written in Perl and we have someone else who's writing in Perl and we need you to come in as basically a Perl developer while also managing these systems, either because their environment has grown and they had one person, now they have two, or two people and now they need four, or they're planning on getting rid of a person, or they just need more redundancy. Like, they really are limiting what their options are, and because of that, the compensation should be higher. And when the compensation is not higher, you will see these job listings that are just listed there for months or years. And anytime I see a job listing that's been open for months, I always question, well, what is the need, or if there's no urgency to fill this role? Do you have candidates who you interviewed weeks or months ago and the position has not been filled? To me, these are all sort of red flags when looking at companies, if you don't see a date listed on when a job was posted, that's definitely, for me, a red flag. Another one is if the pay is not listed. If the pay is not listed, I feel like the chances are very high that the compensation is not going to match what their requirements are of you. And I feel like the thing is these days, Glassdoor alone is not enough to be able to sort of navigate the world of seeking out work and employment and an income because of how much things have changed and how complex things are these days, especially security and privacy wise. Yeah, so a specific programming language is one thing. Specific automation tools is another thing. If they say they run Jenkins or Puppet or Salt, or some say CF Engine still, and then they'll list Pulumi, Terraform, or OpenTofu. It's nice when they say, the listing will say sort of like, this is what we use, but we're looking for someone who might have experience with this type of tool, but not this specific tool. Those are generally more friendly. I feel like when they do list a tool, the compensation should automatically be higher because their expectation is that you're going to use the specific thing that they're using. And sometimes there are better options. And so they're limiting the growth based on what they list. I know this is not always the case, but in the past, what I've seen is when they do list something specific, they're going to be on that platform until the wheels fall off. So this is something else to be mindful of. And then these days, another thing is continuous integration and continuous delivery pipelines. So I feel like if it's a software development company, this will probably be a big thing. Because when you have this type of role, generally it means they're not relying on their software engineers or software developers to be managing this. They will have someone more dedicated to this. But sometimes you'll see this sort of CI/CD listed, and they're not a software company, which is always curious to me. Because with systems, you can do systems work, and a company can have systems people, and they don't necessarily have to offer software or software as a service. There is so much existing software out there that can do what people need. Like with web hosting, I feel like most people offering web hosting are not developing their own web hosting software. When it comes to, like, in the past it would have been Apache. Now there's so many different options. And I understand that these days you're more likely to use web for like APIs and such. And so that would of course be in a company that does software development. But there's so many services that aren't that. One, virtualization. If you're not more focused on hardware, virtualization is probably one of those things that it will probably be required in one way or another because of the way systems have grown with so many cores. In the past, if you had a server and it didn't have many cores, virtualization might not have been something you would have needed. Now, there are systems with hundreds of cores, and of course, you would want to virtualize in that situation. So you'll see some postings that might require something like VMware, ROS, or more and more commonly is Kubernetes. And it feels like that's its own whole can of worms. So I can sort of understand why it would be listed with the systems title, but Kubernetes feels like it's its whole own environment that needs to be managed. And it should be like Kubernetes admin. You know, you're managing that specific application or service. Because once you get to a point where you might require Kubernetes, when you're at that scale, I feel like you're going to have dedicated people working on that. And I feel like that would be beyond the scope of just a developer managing a Kubernetes cluster. But who knows, are there developers who are paid to manage a Kubernetes cluster and do application work? Yikes. And then the last thing, like I mentioned, is that the more requirements that any company lists should be compensating. And I feel like commonly these days, they're not. It's like they're putting everything in their shopping cart, and when they get to the checkout, they're saying, the best I can do is tree fitting. It's like there's some sort of expectation that people have the experience and the willingness to manage all these systems for minimum wage. And it just seems like this is not the kind of job where that expectation should be. Because, in particular, I think about the cost of these services going down and what the cost would be to the company, like CrowdStrike, if these things go down. Basically, if you're not providing an environment where people are wanting to provide the best service they can, you're more likely to have outages. It's like dominoes at that point. So I don't know if it's companies or hiring managers or what, but the expectations should be more appropriate, I feel like, on the company side. I've never heard of someone saying, yeah, we're desperate to find a systems person and we've been looking forever and we're willing to pay top dollar. You don't hear that last part, right? I'm not saying that the compensation should be unreasonable, but they should be willing to pay to get what they need, basically. When you're hiring developers to do systems type stuff is when you see these giant like security compromises, which happens more and more. And hiring security people is absolutely a solution. Otherwise, a third-party security team will name their own price. But I feel like a valuable systems person would also catch these things and be mindful that they would have plans for how they're going to secure the systems while it's being architectured and after it's set up. And I guess that sort of gets into the open source versus closed source. Problems in open source is a good thing. Problems in closed source is not a good thing. The reasoning is with open source, when there's a problem, it can be addressed openly. Everyone's aware of it and everyone can contribute to a solution. In a closed source system, you don't have that. You don't know how horrific the backend is with closed source providers. So anytime there is an open source option available, that is what I'm going to lean towards. I will generally avoid closed source systems because you don't know if they're going to get compromised, and by them getting compromised, your systems get compromised. In the past, you would sort of pay more, and the expectation was that it's closed sourced, and so it's more secure. No one in the outside world is going to know what's going on inside. But of course, the people penetrating these systems, what you hear and what you find when these things are disclosed is that like there are very obvious, maybe it's obvious after the fact, but obvious like glaring issues. And I don't know how many times it's come down to cost. They're trying to cut corners. They're not going to pay to upgrade their systems. They don't want to upgrade their hardware, their software. They don't want to compensate to have the appropriate amount of systems on staff, systems administrators on staff to address these situations. So all in all, it's definitely changed a lot over time. This type of work, what the expectations are, what's available, and it's just not great right now. There's definitely an opportunity to basically deprecate LinkedIn because are they owned by Microsoft now? I'm not sure, but they're not, like LinkedIn is not a great resource. Like these days, it just feels more like, what do people call it? LinkedIn is Grindr for businesses and business people. So, I mean, that's what it's become. It used to be like, oh, well, that's the place to go to look for jobs. And I have found jobs through LinkedIn in the past, but even back then, it wasn't a good experience and feels more like it's getting in the way when it comes to doing anything other than listing openings. Because these days, it's not even accurately listing openings. And then there's like a whole social feed and this and that. Like, yeah. So what I would be interested in hearing is people who have gotten systems type of work in the past few years. I would say in the past year or two, I would be most interested in hearing people who have found a job. How did you do it? And I would be interested in hearing from people who have, 10 or 20 years experience, or if you're brand new, just getting into the market. Because another thing is the application numbers. I do think it's valuable to list how many applications have been received for a job posting, but it's apparent these days that AI is actively being used to apply for jobs. And that's why you'll see hundreds or thousands of listings for a job within a few hours of the job being posted. And with candidates who have no relevant experience or interest in the role that's listed. I feel like you're the person who needs this role filled. It would not be difficult to go through these and quickly weed out what is or isn't going to be what you're looking for. But also, it's probably an opportunity where they could just have their own web app on their company website where it's just narrowed down to specifically like, do you have this experience? This is what we're looking for. Do you have an interest in this? There's probably a bigger opportunity for anyone listing a job to do better than what LinkedIn is offering. But yeah, it seems like we need an aggregator for that, and it ain't LinkedIn. But yeah, if you do have a job searching experience where you were successful, I would love to hear that. I feel like even if you haven't been successful, it would be valuable to hear your experience so that we know what doesn't work, unfortunately. Because in the past, if you were a sysadmin and you wanted work, you could find it. And it feels like that's less of the case these days. More people are becoming developers because of that. But I feel like there is a need, from what I see, for more systems people, especially if they're security minded. So yeah, I would love to hear from you. So until next time that the guy outside decides to stop jackhammering, I'd love to hear from you. We jackhammer inside.